So, Lone Rider here, and I want to talk about something that was in the newspaper. This is the June 13th, 2018 Star Ledger, major New Jersey newspaper. And in particular, I want to talk about this article about ghost guns. Now, you might think that sounds like something that might have been used by Ray Spangler and Egon back in the 1980s, but the reality is that apparently this is an actual term in the lexicon of gun politics now. And what it refers to, I think, is not guns that are some kind of spectral haunt, but guns that are basically not traceable according to serial numbers that are put on firearms that you might buy, let's say from a known manufacturer like Smith & Wesson or Ruger or whatever. The most popular form of these is kits that people can buy, or parts like people can buy, an 80% lower receiver. And what that means essentially is that the receiver isn't finished; it's only 80% complete. So someone will, if they're buying a complete firearm, there'll be a serial number on it. There'll be all of this stuff. If you just buy the incomplete receiver, that's not regulated because it's not complete. It's not functional in the state in which you're purchasing it. You're purchasing it in an unfinished condition. And the state of New Jersey doesn't want people to have these for obvious reasons, because we're very the laws here are very strict. So the article here is very clear. It says AG warns makers of ghost guns, and it starts off by saying, quote, New Jersey's Attorney General on Tuesday sent warning letters to manufacturers of unregistered ghost guns as state lawmakers pursue a formal ban on the sale of firearms parts used to make untraceable homemade guns. Quote, these weapons are illegal in our state, unquote, Attorney General Gerbir Grewal wrote in the letter. Your actions violate the laws of New Jersey, and if you do not stop these activities within 15 days, I will bring legal action against your company. Unquote. Okay, now, already we have a little bit of a problem because they describe warning letters to the manufacturers of unregistered ghost guns. They don't say ghost gun parts, they don't say ghost gun kits, they say ghost guns. But the whole reason they're ghost guns is because they're not finished firearms. So you could argue that these people are the manufacturers of unfinished parts kits, of components. To argue that they're the manufacturer of the guns is kind of misleading, I would say. You might call this nitpicking, but the truth is that's the whole reason that the government's worried about these things. If they were completely manufactured by the people that are manufacturing the parts kits, they would have to have the serial numbers, and they'd be required to jump through all the hoops that you have to jump through to purchase a finished firearm. For many of these you don't, which is why there's such an issue to the people who don't want people to have guns at all. So right there we have a problem. Are the people that are manufacturing these parts and these kits, are they actually the manufacturer, quote unquote, of the gun, or is the manufacturer of the gun actually the end user, the customer, who buys the part and finishes it and then assembles all the other components? And like I said, somebody might call that nitpicking, but that's kind of the point of laws, is to look at the details of what they say and what they don't say, and just a thought there. Second, he says these weapons are illegal in our state. Well, if you skip to the very end of this article, this is a 9-paragraph article, way down here they talk about what a ghost gun actually is. And they say pretty much what I said, that it's a kit or unfinished parts group. But they add in something else. They add in a suggestion or a theory about the reason why people might want this. So they don't just define ghost guns, not at the top of the article where they should be defining it, since that's the topic. They define it all the way down at the end, third paragraph from the end, but they define it in such a way that they don't just define ghost guns, they throw in a characterization of the people who might want to buy them, which might be true in some cases, but clearly there's other reasons why somebody might want to get them, and I'll get to that in a second. They say, quote, supporters of the state crackdown say people who would otherwise be prohibited from legally buying a gun can purchase parts one piece at a time, I guess like the Johnny Cash song, one piece at a time, and assemble them using kits that can be ordered online, end quote. Now, they're defining loosely the idea of ghost guns, therefore, as basically uncompleted firearms. But they're also throwing in a characterization of the people who might want to buy them, or the reason you might want to buy them, when they say that, quote, people who would otherwise be prohibited from legally buying a gun can purchase parts one piece at a time and assemble them using kits, unquote. Now, it's true that if you wanted to avoid New Jersey's draconian gun laws, because you weren't, let's say, allowed to legally buy a gun, um, you could do it this way. I guess the question is, would the average criminal bother to do that? Some of these criminals know people who know people, and they could get a gun just by saying, "Psst, hey, Pete, you got a Glock?" Whereas, like, I don't know anybody I could do that with because I don't hang out with criminals and bad people. If I did, I could probably get a gun illegally myself just by, again, opening my door and yelling, "Hey, I want to buy a gun." There's probably some guy down the street who's got a whole trunk full of them. But the point is, I don't know people like that. Why? Because I'm not a criminal, and I don't hang out with criminals. Which is kind of ironic, because the whole point is the people you're worried about, the people that you say, quote, would otherwise be prohibited from obtaining weapons, are the very people who don't have to jump through the hoops because they know people who they can buy a secondhand gun on the street. And those people aren't going to check references, just to let you know. The people who you're not worried about, the people who wouldn't hurt anybody because they're not a career criminal, they're not a violent person, they're not a bad dude, a bad hombre. Guys like me who don't want to hurt anybody, if we wanted a gun for whatever reason somebody would want a gun, we couldn't do that. We have to jump through the hoops just because we don't know any of these bad people. But if there's the ghost gun option, we could do that. And I guess it's not only bad writing in that they start talking about ghost guns up here, but they don't define them until the third paragraph to the end of the article. It's that in that definition, they throw in there a condemnation of the ghost gun idea. And they seem to be suggesting that the only reason that anybody would want one of these is to dodge the law. And the implication being that that's because they're a bad person with something to hide and they couldn't pass a background check or whatever. Well, what about two other alternatives? And I'll just throw them out there. And I think when I throw them out there, it'll be pretty obvious that the fact that Governor Murphy and his Attorney General Grewal didn't even conceive of the idea that these could be reasons for going the ghost gun route or wanting to, illustrates how short-sighted and closed-minded they are about firearms. I'm a bicyclist. I bike a lot. I'm really into it. I've been a cyclist since the 90s, so like 20-odd years. And a few years ago, I had a chance to actually build a bike from scratch. A friend of mine had welding equipment and brazing equipment. He had a jig, and with his help and some daring do, I filed the tubes. I measured everything. I put it together in the jig. I brazed it together. I sent it off to have it painted, and I had a custom-made bike frame. My friend made the fork and did some of the little fittings. I made the main frame from scratch, from metal tubing. And you could say, well, why would you do that? Couldn't you just go and buy a bike? Well, yeah, but if you're really into it, you want to customize it. Maybe you want to get a better understanding of things like frame geometry and how things fit together. It's kind of like, I like to use the analogy of, like in Star Wars, how the last step in Jedi training was for the Jedi to build his own lightsaber. Yes, he could just have a lightsaber and use it, but the idea of building it yourself, it gives you that much of a more intimate connection to the weapon, and it makes it, it gives you a better understanding of it, and so on and so forth. And this isn't unusual for people who are into any hobby or interest. How many car people work on their own cars, rebuild engines and do that? How many people are into like audio equipment? I know at least 3 guys that like work on their own stereos, take them apart. They use like vacuum tubes and they build like amps and stuff. They refurbish vintage stereos. Watches. This is a crappy old Timex, but I was at one point really into vintage watches, and I still have a few lying around. And I've done everything from customized case finishes and actually reshape the contours of a watch case, like a stainless steel dive watch, for example, to either give it a different finish, a dull finish, or physically reshape the case, to replacing bezels and bands and doing all kinds of other stuff. I know another guy who was even more into it than I used to be, who actually works on the internals of the watches. And I have, in fact, done that myself in the past, not recently. And lastly is the archery example. I mean, I shoot bows, and while I do have a store-bought recurve, I took it upon myself when I was first starting out, because I didn't want to go and spend the money. I made a couple cheapy PVC bows just to see if I'd even like the idea of shooting. When I realized I liked the idea of shooting, I went out and I bought a store-bought recurve because it was more powerful and more dependable. But since then, I really got into it, and I said, I want to make my own bow. I want to customize it. I want to do things, get a better understanding of it. And I wanted maybe a type of bow that wasn't on the market. Not because it was illegal or restricted, but just, that's not an issue with archery equipment the way it is with some types of guns. But simply because I wanted something different that wasn't out there that I couldn't just buy off the shelf. And in particular, I wanted like an old style, one piece of wood longbow. So I carved one out of hickory using hand tools. Now I could have special ordered one from a custom bowyer, but it would have cost a lot of money. I would have had to go buy it off the internet and have it shipped. And this was something that I could do myself for a fraction of the cost, and I could have a learning experience and really get to the nitty gritty of what makes the tools that I'm using in my hobby. And whether it's bikes, whether it's wristwatches, whether it's stereo equipment, whether it's cars, whether it's guns, this is a normal thing. The fact that people would understand that it's normal with amplifiers or with car engines or with bicycles, but not with guns, I think it's like they got a blind spot. It's like they've got self-imposed intellectually created myopia, and I think it's sad. But more importantly, it's illustrative of the fact that nobody might think that, well, why would somebody want to make a custom gun from, not necessarily from scratch, because you're buying the unfinished pieces, but as close to scratch as you can get with something like that, where the parts have to fit together and there has to be tight tolerances. They may be doing it because they're a felon and they want to dodge the rules, or they may be doing it because they're just really into guns, and that's what people do when they're really into something. The fact that that never even occurs to people like Gov'r Murphy and all these jablones, I think that speaks volumes about their understanding of firearms and firearms people. Just as it would speak volumes if you said to somebody who works on their own bikes or even built a bike from scratch, well, why would you do that? What, are you too poor to buy one off the shelf? No, that just shows how ignorant you are of the hobby or the interest and the people who pursue it. And another thing is the rules themselves. When the rules are reasonable, people have no problem obeying them and waiting in line and doing everything the way that the government wants them to do it. When the rules become draconian, people try to find ways around them. And if there's a legal way, without breaking the law, that you can purchase the parts and put it together, you may not be doing it because you want to do it, and you want to build a custom AR or whatever the hell it is, and you really want that experience of building your own as much as you can. It may be that you just don't feel like going through all the hassle. And if it's legal to do it that way, what's wrong with that? The assumption the government seems to be making, or people in the government, like this Gov'r Murphy fellow, seems to be making, is that anybody who wouldn't want to jump through all these wonderful hoops, pay the exorbitant fees, wait, and then have doubts as to whether or not you're even going to pass through the process, even if you've never done anything wrong in your life and have nothing to hide, because they're always talking about making that process stricter and stricter and stricter. Who wouldn't want to go through all that? Well, anybody with a brain, right? I mean, seriously. So, if the rules themselves were just very basic, very plain, very simple, very unobtrusive, and clearly created only to deter bad guys, then no law-abiding citizen would object to jumping through those hoops, because they'd be very few hoops and far between and easy to jump through. But when the people who craft those hoops and enforce them are constantly talking about making it stricter and stricter and stricter and stricter, at some point you look at it and you're like, okay, these people have basically announced their intention to strangle us by inches. Clearly, this isn't a well-intentioned process that's just intended to deter criminals. Clearly, it's really intended to deter anybody who wants to buy a firearm. And that seems to be their end goal, whether they admit it all the time or not. And some of them do admit it. I mean, Governor Murphy, when he was running for office, before he was Governor Murphy, made a statement, and I'm paraphrasing here, but made a statement in another Star Ledger article to the effect that he would sign, quote, any gun, and again, I'm paraphrasing, so maybe I shouldn't say quote, but to the effect that he would sign any gun control legislation that came across his desk. Now, what that says to me is that there's no point beyond which he wouldn't go. So, a background check, for example, most of us clearly don't want somebody with a violent criminal record or somebody who, let's say, was declared mentally unstable and, committed. We don't want those people to be able to purchase a firearm if, because of that, we think they're going to be dangerous. And certainly, the idea of deranged or unstable, people who pose a risk because there's something wrong upstairs, like the people who do these mass murders, like the shooting in Florida and stuff like that. It would certainly have been better if, those people had been stopped from getting their hands on weapons. Nobody's questioning that. My question is, when you have somebody who says that basically there's no point beyond which they wouldn't go, when is that going to go from, okay, we don't want somebody who's a violent felon or somebody who's crazy from getting a gun, to we don't want anybody who had anything that might even raise an issue about, so you could have somebody who hit their head and got a minor concussion when they were 12 playing pee-wee football. That's technically a brain injury. Is that person going to be, for the rest of their life, forever declared incompetent to own a firearm and exercise their constitutional rights because they once got a mild concussion while playing pee-wee football at the age of 12? If you have somebody who once took a sleeping pill or Xanax, or who saw a therapist, for, let's say, marriage counseling, their marriage was on the rocks and they saw a therapist for a few months, does that mean they're crazy and they can't be trusted with a weapon? Where is this going to go? Where won't it stop? All of us pretty much agree, myself included, that you shouldn't have deranged people walking around with guns. My question is, when does that definition of deranged people start to include regular folks? You, me, your neighbors, etc. And the problem is we don't get any assurance that it won't. Actually, what we get is an assurance that it will. When somebody like Murphy says, I'll sign anything you put in front of me, he's basically saying that his gun control crusade is open-ended, that there's no point beyond which it won't go, there's no point it won't stop at, and that he's not going to be satisfied by one or two so-called common sense rules. He's going to keep going until the restrictions are as strict as he can make them before people revolt and vote him and folks like him out of office, which frankly I'm surprised hasn't happened already. I mean, they're always talking about how the laws in places like New Jersey should be stricter. What we forget is the laws in places like New Jersey are so strict that, you need a firearms license for something like a BB gun, which isn't actually a firearm. Yet, the same people who have imposed laws that strict are telling us that the laws are too lax and anybody can just walk into a store and buy an Uzi. Yeah, how does that work? It doesn't, of course. But the very fact that, they seem to be having the approach that, well, anybody who doesn't want to jump through these hoops must have some nefarious motive. They never even consider that maybe the hoops are too draconian, that maybe the process has gone beyond where the average person has any respect for it, and that if there's a legal and an above-board way for them to avoid that, why wouldn't they? Just like they never consider that somebody who's really into a hobby might want to, really get down to the nitty-gritty of not just using the tools of that hobby, but actually making them. And, the fact that people like Governor Murphy think that the only reason anybody would want a so-called ghost gun is because there's some bad hombre with, something to hide. It says that they don't know much about people who pursue the shooting sports and have an interest in mechanical things, that some of us actually like to make our own stuff. And it also doesn't show, it shows that he has no idea of how absurd the rules really seem to most people, and that, yeah, if there's a way you can go around that without breaking the law, that you're going to do that. And without breaking the law comes back to this point here. The beginning of the article, they say that these are illegal in New Jersey. At the very end of the article, the last paragraph, the last sentence says, quote, another bill still awaiting legislative approval would criminalize the ownership of ghost guns. That's that right there. At the very bottom. So wait, another bill still awaiting approval, legislative approval, would criminalize the ownership of ghost guns. So at the time this article was written, this wasn't illegal. But what are they saying in the letters they're sending to the people who manufacture the parts kits, who they erroneously call the manufacturers of the guns, even though they're not guns, they're parts kits? Well, they say, quote, these weapons are illegal in our state. Attorney General, I'm not even going to try and say that again, wrote in a letter. Your actions violate the laws of New Jersey. But at the very bottom of the article, we have that another bill still awaiting legislative approval would criminalize the ownership of ghost guns. So are they illegal or are they not? The article seems to be saying up here that they're, according the Attorney General is saying, at the behest of the governor, because he's not going off and doing this on his own and being a rebel. He's, Murphy tells him to do it and he does it. So at the behest of the governor, this guy is telling all these companies that these are illegal in New Jersey. But at the very bottom of the article, down here, the article is saying that actually there is a law being considered that would ban them, but it hasn't been passed yet and may not be passed. It says awaiting legislative approval. What if the legislator doesn't decide to approve it? Well, then they've sent out letters warning people that something's illegal when it's not, at least according to this article. And I guess what we get here is that not only is this a very poorly written article, and not only is it incredibly one-sided, the entire article only talks about the gun control side. They never even seem to consider that there's, again, other reasons why people might want one of these, another take on the issue, etc. The article also, the way it's written, it gives you the impression, at least it gives me the impression, that the Attorney General was frickin' lying to all these people, that he sent out letters threatening to prosecute them for something that wasn't illegal and may not be if that, quote, bill still awaiting legislative approval to criminalize the ownership of ghost guns, unquote, doesn't actually get approved. I mean, what is he? Does Governor Murphy have a time machine? Is the DeLorean parked in Trenton somewhere and he's gone into the future with Doc Brown and Marty McFly and he's seen that this has already been passed? No. Now, it may be that he's looking at the people in the legislature and saying, well, they hate guns too, and so I can kind of count on their vote. Maybe. But the point is, whether he thinks that they're going to approve it or not is irrelevant. It hasn't been approved. It's not illegal, according to this news article. Yet, according to the news article, the Attorney General is telling people it's illegal. So I guess the takeaway here is that these people, like Murphy, don't just want common sense gun rules. They want an open-ended agenda against firearm ownership by citizens. There's no point beyond which they won't go. They've already stated that. And as far as what this particular article illustrates, well, the media has a one-sided view of the issue. It doesn't bother to show anything except the people who hate the guns. The Attorney General is sending out letters threatening to prosecute people for something that, according to the same article at the very end, isn't actually illegal yet. So I guess the Attorney General and gun control advocates generally lie a lot. I mean, that's my takeaway from this. They lie a lot and they don't consider other viewpoints. And, for years when I've heard things like high-capacity magazines, quote-unquote, or assault rifles, I've kind of tuned it out because, the people who are saying assault rifle are actually talking about a civilian semi-auto. The people who are talking about high-capacity magazines are actually talking about either normal or substandard capacity magazines for that type of firearm, etc. I guess we can kind of add ghost guns to that list now because from what I've read here, they're making a big fuss about them when there's not really much to be. So somebody's buying a parts kit and putting something together. I do that with bike stuff all the time. Now, granted, you could say, well, people aren't getting shot to death with bikes. That's true. But we have no idea that anybody who's buying these wants to shoot anybody. All we know is that maybe, if they're not doing it because they're really into guns and they just want to build their own, maybe they don't feel like jumping through the hoops. But given how draconian the hoops are, does that mean they have anything to hide, or does that just mean they're a normal fracking person with a brain in their head? So, I think we can kind of add ghost guns to the list of, scares. But more importantly, I think we can look at this and say, you know, according to this article, either this article is more poorly written than it looks, or the Attorney General lied. He threatened to jail people or prosecute companies for something that's not yet illegal at the time this was written. And who knows if it will ever be. And that's pretty sad. But then again, the whole gun control agenda is pretty sad. You've got a bunch of people out there who want to criminalize stuff because they're intolerant, they're small-minded, they're ignorant, and they've got a phobia. And you know what? If you don't like guns, that's great. I can respect that. I don't like golf. And the difference is, I'm not out there saying we should ban 9 irons. Right? Lone Rider out.